Hey, how you doing? It's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net, and in this video I'm going to be drawing up a character concept for Rob Arnold's Replicator comic book issue 3. Now this was a really fun character to work on, I have to say. Rob gave me the lowdown on who the character was going to be, even shared with me a few very rough sketches on how he was going to look, which I duly took and started working on straight away. Actually, I didn't start working on the character straight away. I took a little bit of time off work over Easter, went camping actually, got back in touch with nature somewhat, managed to get some rays. You know, a lot of the time I'm locked away here in the studio by choice. I enjoy not being in the sun too much and just spending my days drawing away. But, you know, I mean, it's good to get out, get a few rays and yeah, hit the old reset button, so to speak. But, of course, when I came back, I got straight to work on this character, which I was really looking forward to, in all honesty. I like to draw a lot of female characters, but I also like to draw a lot of male characters, especially when they're kind of freaky-deaky looking like this guy's going to be. The character did have a bio, which I'm not going to share too much about, just because I'm not sure how much Rob wants me to give away here. But for now, what I will say is the character is supposed to look very sickly looking, okay? So he's going to look kind of scrawny, but also fairly buff. For some reason, I gave him big shoulders, big biceps and triceps. I guess I wanted him to look dangerous, even though he was scrawny. You know, he's kind of creepy, he's dangerous looking, he looks as though he could handle himself in a fight if he needed to. But a lot of the inspiration that I took for this particular character, because I knew that he was going to be very malnourished looking, is I found some screenshots from The Machinist, right? And if you've seen this movie, you'll know that Christian Bale, who stars as the main character within it, got really, really skinny and scrawny. You know, he was anorexic. It was so bad that he was on the verge of having some health problems from just not eating anything for the entire time that he was working on this film. And of course, after that, he jumped straight onto Batman Begins and got super beefy looking all of a sudden. In fact, it got to the point where he had transformed his body so much after this movie in preparation for Batman Begins that he put on a little bit too much weight for Batman, which is always insane when actors are able to just transform their body in that type of way. I mean, that's dedication right there. That's dedication to your art. So let's talk about the concept itself. Now, as you saw, I started out with a very basic, very rough foundation, which is something that I always do. If you've watched any of my videos, you'll know that I need that in order to take the drawing to the next level. If I don't have that foundation where I've established the placement of the character, how they're going to be posed, what their proportions are going to be, then things start going sideways very, very quickly, because that foundation is the very thing that determines the success of the drawing in the long run. Because if I don't have those proportions sorted in the beginning, then everything that I place in on top, all the details, all the anatomy, literally every single aspect of the drawing that's drawn from that point onward is going to be out of proportion. So it's very important to make sure those fundamental principles are handled first and foremost that make the foundations of every solid, well-structured drawing. Because, again, I mean, that's just wise to do as an artist, especially a comic book artist, where your work is under scrutiny constantly by the reader, by the audience. And in this case, it'll be under scrutiny by the client. You know, if the character doesn't look right, and it's very easy for a human character not to look correct because we're so used to seeing other people in the everyday world. You know, we know what a person's proportions is supposed to be, especially in an idealized format such as comic book art. We know how their face needs to be structured, where their eyes and nose and mouth need to sit. And if those things aren't kept in check, then the character just looks deformed, or like, you know, they're not quite structured in the correct way physically, which is totally fine. You know, sometimes you're going to get characters, especially like this one, where, you know, their body might be distorted in some manner, depending on whether or not they're a villain or they're supposed to be an idealized heroic type character. So you've got to balance that stuff out a little bit, and it's not going to be the same from character to character, especially if you're working on a story where you've got a more diverse cast. You're dealing with different body types, different literally it could be different bone structures, right down to the skeleton, and essentially that foundation is serving as the skeleton of the drawing, that you're hanging the anatomy off, that you're putting over the top of that the design of the character, and then the details that articulated on that next level of refinement. So once the foundations are done, I turn them to blue, and then I sketch out the basic design right in over the top of that. And the great thing about it is I'm able to focus just purely on the design at that point. I don't have to worry about whether the character is sized up. I don't have to worry about the proportions anymore. All of that is done. Now all I've got to focus on is the creative aspects of the design. And that's when it gets really, really fun. You know, I'll put on some tunes, I'll listen to some inspirational music just to get me into the mood. And yeah, I'll start letting my creativity loose out onto the canvas. And that's where really things start to take off, where I start really enjoying the process. I mean, I enjoy every aspect of my art, I really, really do. But I guess that this is the point at which I can kind of let go of the technical considerations, stop analyzing it so much, and just really, let myself sink into the feeling that every creator craves, which is coming up with something new, something that doesn't already exist. And I think that one thing that I love about concept art is that ultimately this character that I'm designing the look of is going to be brought to life in a finished production. Now, depending on what you're doing the concept art for, it might be a movie, it might be a video game, it might be a comic book, as is the case here. There's going to be some kind of story written around this character, and they're going to be given some life, a soul within this book that people are going to read about, that people are going to be able to immerse themselves in and get to know this character on a much more profound level. So that's what I love about concept art first and foremost, and why it kind of, runs in unison with my passion for creating comic books. And it's really fantastic when I can link the two together and do comic book styled concept art, which is exactly what you're seeing here on the page. And I guess every creator out there, Rob Arnold, who I'm doing this concept for, and every other independent comic book creator who is going to have a cast of characters, or even the environments within the books, you're going to really want to solidify what the characters look like beforehand so that the artist has something to work off. Why is that so important? Well, having a solid concept design for the different characters within the book and the world, literally, that they navigate around in, is going to give your comic much more consistency. From panel to panel, the character will look the same. And from scene to scene, the scene will be consistent. Especially if you do like an overhead layout of the environment. I mean, that adds to the realism of the world that you're trying to get the audience to buy into. Now, back to the concept here itself. So I've got the foundation down, which I've turned off. You can't see it at all at this point. And then over the top of that, we've done the really rough design sketch. At the rough design sketch stage, I'll actually pass that off to the client just so that they can kind of double check the direction that I'm intending to go in, that I'm intending to, refine the illustration toward. And once I get the okay from them, then I will move on to the next stage, which is what you're seeing happen right here, the refinement stage, where we polish the design, we clean up the line work, make it slick, sharp, and energetic, give it depth with line weights, which, we mentioned and we brought up in the last video, and of course the details and the rendering, which essentially turn up the sharpness of the design and bring it that much more into focus. Again, at that point, what this part of the process is really aimed toward is introducing additional levels of depth to the illustration to make it look more convincing and more believable. And this is the stage that I get super excited. I get excited at every single part of the process, because it's at this stage that we actually get to see the character in a way where they're ultra refined, that we know what they're going to look like. We have a very clear vision as to where the end of the road is going to lead us. And so I get excited at every point of the illustration, but it's for different reasons. And this particular chapter, this end game essentially, no pun intended, by the way. I know that the end game has just come out in the cinema, but this particular part of the process where we're nearing the end of it is just where I get so excited, because like all the hard work that I put in, all the groundwork that I've put into the foundation is now leading to the conclusion where I can see the result of that investment. I can see the return on it. And that's awesome. To know that your illustration is going in the direction that you want it to go in. It's a much better alternative than having an illustration that is just running right off track. And when you've got a good foundation that you've laid in the beginning, the chances are that you're going to have to deal with that are very minimal. Usually if you get those foundations solid at the beginning, everything else is set. You don't really have to worry about it running off track so much. It's probably going to turn out like 90% chance of turning out the way that you want it to, and it's going to have a minimal amount of mistakes. All that you have to worry about at that point, at the refinement stage where you're placing in the rendering, is articulating the forms in an accurate way, is presenting the materials and the textures that are going to be rendered in a believable manner that people understand. And really, I think when it comes to character design, this is the main goal that you should have, is you really need to make sure that your vision as to how the character looks, your perception of it, matches the perception that the viewer is going to have when they ultimately take it in. That's called visual communication, and the more you can do that, the more you can solidify that link between you and the audience, the more effective at visual communication you're going to be. And every aspect of comic book art and concept art is about effective visual communication, because there's a wide variety of ways that people can interpret your work, and everyone's an individual, right? So you want to make sure that that their perception of it, no matter how different they are, no matter how their worldviews might align, you want to make sure that your character is going to appear to them in the same way that it appears to you. Because if it doesn't, then there's going to be a disconnect. Then you have no control over how your work is going to be perceived, which is essentially the whole point as to why you would be doing it in the first place. You're not, otherwise, that person could just create their own idea. And of course, the only reason that you would take the time to design a character is to present some kind of idea that you have to them so that they can get it, so that they can understand it in the same way. Again, it's really important to make sure, especially when it comes to comic book art, that you, for example, as the concept designer and the actual artist who is going to be working on the final comic book in this case, and I'm not quite sure who that's going to be. This is a concept that I've come up with for Replicator issue 3, so as much as I would love to work on that, by the way, and who knows, I don't want to necessarily rule anything out for the future, because you never know what's going to happen necessarily, or what the result of my relationship with Rob is going to lead to. I don't, as much as I would love to work on it, it's probably going to have another artist on it completely, which is why Rob's getting me to do these concepts in the first place, just so that he can determine what the look is going to be and pass that along to the artist, the penciler, and the inker, to make sure that the concept that he has in mind for the book, the way that the characters are going to look, that those artists understand without a doubt exactly what they need to go for when it comes to illustrating them. Which is why the concept artist's job in a lot of these different productions is one of the most important, because when the concept artist hits upon a design, which is, the design that's going to be used for the rest of the production, that ultimately determines, at least on a visual level, the success of that that particular production, whether it's a comic book, whether it's a movie, whether it's a video game. And when you think about the amount of investment that needs to be put into a given project, how long it takes to produce a full comic book, how long it takes to produce a full movie or a full video game, years and years and years, sometimes billions of, well, maybe not billions, but millions and millions of dollars of production, especially with video games and movies these days. Maybe not so much comic book art, but we could say, tens of thousands of dollars for a finished comic book. That's the budget for it, usually, what it's going to be. You want to make sure that whatever design you've come up with for the characters, that's going to work, because the producer is putting, whoever is funding the project is putting a lot of investment into this. There's a lot riding on it, usually financially, and if it's a passion project, it's their passion is riding on it. So, especially when you're working on somebody else's book, they might be the writer, they might be the creator, but if you're doing if you're imagining how that idea is going to look for them, you've got a lot of responsibility there. You've got to make sure that you're doing the best possible job that you can. And hopefully you are, because it means that they're probably going to pay you. So it's a good thing for you. And it means that your concept is going to be seen in the final product, and that can be really, really rewarding. So we're really at the rendering and the refinement stage here with the Pain concept. That's this character's name, again, if I haven't already mentioned that. And you can just imagine what kind of carnage this guy is going to cause in the comic book with a name like that. I don't know exactly how he's going to navigate within the comic. I don't know what's going to happen within the story. I've got a very brief bio as to, who this character is going to be, just enough for me to work with and determine visually how he's going to look. But beyond that, I don't have a whole lot to go on. So it's going to be exciting for me, what the ultimate manifestation of this character is going to look like in the finished book. So, yeah, at this point, the cool thing about it is I'm jumping into the details, which is so fun, because you really have a lot more free roam there as to what you can do. You can mess around with how the character is going to be lit at that point. You can figure out how detailed they're going to be, how you're going to texture them. I think the primary thing to keep in mind, though, is ensuring that all the foundations that you've already laid down underneath the surface remain consistent, that the details that you do place on top aren't going to change them too much, because they most definitely can. The way in which you render a form can dramatically change it in a huge way if you're not ensuring that the way in which that form is lit underneath a given lighting condition remains consistent with that rendering, because rendering and details is really just translation to shading the form that you're working on. You're shading the form, and then you're giving it texture. You're giving it, some level of comprehension as to how that particular object would feel to touch. Now, when it comes to comic book characters and the way in which you might stylize them, you're not going to get to a super fine detailed level necessarily, especially if you're working on them from a distance. Like, you'd never render out the skin pores of a character, for example. There's no way in the world you would do that. A lot of the time, you want to leave that kind of thing up to interpretation, because the viewer is just going to fill in those details. They're going to assume them as a given without you having to necessarily articulate them, and it would just look weird if you did articulate them. You're not going to see skin pores unless, for example, your face is right up against the character's head, or body, wherever you're looking at or observing the skin pores from. But this is more applicable to hair. People go really overboard on hair when it comes to comic book character art. And the thing with hair is that you're not, we have this inclination to refine every single strand, but that's not the case at all. Hair is really, if anything, a texture that you add over the top the main form that you've established for its style. And so that's the main form that comes first. You have to make sure that the shape of the hairstyle is readable first and foremost. But then, over the top of that, you might place in the hair texture. However, the hair texture is really determined by the lighting conditions. So you're only placing, the greatest amounts, the congestion of hair strands in the darkest areas of that form to, articulate it and to suggest it. But in the areas where you're going to see the lightest point of value, I guess, where the form itself is going to be most lit, in those areas you want to leave them relatively bare, because if you add too much rendering there, if you articulate those strands too much, you're going to suggest dips in the form, that there's some kind of dark crevasse, because it's going to appear as a darker value on the head. It's that simple, really. So the last thing you want to do is refine the individual strands on a character's head. You know, even with a character here like Pain, who has long hair, which is dark, you will get a little bit more rendering there that suggests a few more strands, but again, it's not going to be every single strand that's presented within the hair. Just as with the skin pores, unless your face is right up against someone's head, you're not going to be able to even make them out. They're going to be super out of focus, which is why from a distance, the only thing you can really see as far as people's hair goes is the main primary shape of it, with some suggestion of the texture, which ultimately in turn suggests the strands that make it up. Now jumping on to the final example of the concept here, I'm going to articulate the back view of how Pain is going to look. This was a really fun particular illustration to work on, just this little bit, because I guess I'm surprised sometimes that I can even draw characters from the back. You know, I'm very uncomfortable, like a lot of artists are, drawing characters from behind, because it's just not a common occurrence. Like I guess I'm usually focused on drawing them from the front or the side or the 3/4 angle, but never from behind, and especially not from the 3/4 back angle, as you can see here. But when it did turn out the way it did, I was surprised. I'm like, oh yeah, maybe I can, maybe I'm not too bad at drawing these characters from the back. And when that happens, when you do better than you expect you're going to do, that's always a pleasant surprise. It kind of boosts your confidence a little bit. Now, at the back here, what I want to point out is just the fact that his suspenders kind of go and lead into this, I guess, little connector at the back there. I have no idea what the terminology for suspenders would be, but they kind of click into this downward triangular type shape and down into the pants. However, I did not know that at first. I actually thought they were like overalls, that they just kind of went up around the shoulders and down at the back and kind of, you know, remained separated. But that wasn't the case. And the only reason that I knew that that wasn't the case is because I actually looked up some examples, some reference examples of how suspenders looked from behind, which, you know, is why it's so important to use reference material, because if you don't use reference material, then there's a high chance that what you're trying to convey in a visual form is going to be inaccurate. That just about wraps up this concept demonstration. You know, I usually get them done fairly fast. In real time, this particular concept took about, I would say, just under 4 hours. You know, again, I put a little bit more effort into this one because you know, I knew that I was going to use it for a video demonstration, and I might even include it in a future sketchbook. I'm not too sure yet about the sketchbook, but I'm kind of, you know, I'm racking up these illustrations, and I think it'd be pretty cool, depending on the kind of interest that's received, to put them out there a little bit, because there's a lot of illustrations that I do that I don't really, I guess, put out to the public. So it'd be cool to give you an inside look, if, you know, I end up going through with that idea. It's a lot of ideas I don't go through on or follow through on, so we'll have to wait and see. But I hope you liked this demonstration. It was just a quick rough one. Well, not too rough, actually. We refined it a fair bit. I hope you got a lot of value out of it, and that, you know, you find these videos useful, and hopefully you can apply some of what I'm showing you in them, because that's the main idea, that you're able to apply what you're seeing and see actual change within your own work. If you'd like more comic art tips, tricks, and tutorials, please head on over to www.howtodrawcomics.net, the site in which all these videos are hosted, which I create these videos for in the first place. You'll also find a bunch of written tutorials, a heck load of podcast episodes, or at least one of those a week, and of course we've also got a growing course library over on the site, which delves into a lot of these topics on a much deeper level. So check them out as well if you want to, if you want to get serious about developing your skills as a comic book artist, because there's a lot of valuable content on there. But until next time, keep on creating, keep on practicing, and I'll see you here in the next video.